Okay, welcome back. This is part 2 of the Assessing Knowledge and Deep Understanding lecture piece. This is the second half of the slideshow. We left off last time talking about selected response questions and some of the different kinds of possible uses for those, and cautioned all of you that there were better and worse uses of the selected response format. Today we're going to talk about the constructed response format, and we're all very familiar with these kinds of questions, for example, essay questions. And there are a lot of forms of essay questions, and we in fact see that they fall upon a continuum. And that continuum really is in how much freedom of response is allowed. We can go all the way from very restricted response essays that have to be constrained to extremely specific criteria to extended response essays that just have a loose organizational theme and topic. And we can kind of we'll talk about what some of the limitations are, especially of the extended response open essays. Even though they're appealing in some ways, they suffer from some really serious problems in terms of reliability and fairness, I think. When I use the term reliability, in many cases when we're talking about teacher-corrected assignments, I think it's important to remember that when you don't mark things equally, or you don't mark things in a consistent manner, it's really an equity issue. It's a fairness issue. So it's not really even so much a technical issue for me. Yes, we can measure it in a technical sense, but it's really about a fairness piece for students. So let's look at the restricted response essay. This type of an essay, or short answer as we might often call it, limits content and the response that is given. We can limit how narrowly the question is phrased. We can be very specific as a short answer question. We can limit the scope of the problem that we pose. We can do that with an introduction. For example, an interpretive exercise is one type of constrained restricted response essay format. So we can approach the objectivity of short answer and interpretive exercises with a restricted response essay by really limiting what it is that the students can write about and what they can talk about. That way we can measure, do they understand a particular concept or don't they, and not start to get at things like how well do they write. The extended response essay, on the other hand, allows us great freedom. It allows the student to engage in problem formulation, organization, and to express originality. It shares very similar scoring difficulties with other kinds of performance-based tasks, where it's difficult to quantify the performance as a whole. Sometimes we see something and we say, that's really good. And then if you were to ask people why it's really good, and they'll list off some component criteria. For example, if we were to think about a ballet performance, and we were to think about that performance being really good, we would often point out, well, they were very precise movements, they were in time, but it's probably more than that. It's probably that the dancer shows expression, that there's a sense of the performance is more than the sum of its component measurable parts. And so it is with other kinds of essays and other kinds of performances that we ask students to do in school. It's difficult sometimes to express why something is good. Again, we can point to particular pieces, but we've all experienced this sense that there are certain things that are better than the sum of their parts. Equally, there are other kinds of essays that are worse than the sum of their parts. The sum of their parts, they're all there, and if we use a rubric to grade them, we mark that they have this and they have that, but it doesn't really all quite fit together. And it's difficult to say exactly why that's true. So essays have a number of uses. We represent this continuum in complexity and breadth of learning outcomes. And on one end we have interpretive exercises, and restricted response essays perhaps are in the middle, and then we have extended response essays at the right end, if you think about a left to right continuum with least amount of complexity and breadth of learning outcomes assessed to greatest amount. But we can also put on that same chart of left to right the least degree, the least amount of reliability usually in scoring, or excuse me, the greatest amount of reliability in scoring on the left end with the constricted response, interpretive exercises. Restricted response essays in the middle have less reliability than do the interpretive exercises, and our extended response essays on the right end have the least amount of reliability typically. So restricted response essays. This is for learning outcomes that we cannot readily assess objectively. In other words, that we can't easily slide into either a multiple choice question or some other kind of standard format where there are forced choice outcomes. If we compare it to the extended response questions, we target narrower learning outcomes, such as drawing maybe a more specific mental process forward. For example, the student draws a valid conclusion from a single passage. This is a good example of a restricted response essay. Extended response essays, these are for those kinds of learning outcomes that are not readily assessed objectively or with a restricted response essay. And compared to our restricted response questions, these assess broader learning outcomes. We can ask students to integrate a whole set of things. For example, we can ask them to integrate evidence to evaluate a scientific theory. So we might present them with a scenario. They've been studying scientific theory, and then they'll pull out all of the elements of that scenario. Maybe it might be the process that Alexander Graham Bell went through in developing the telephone, or it might be the process that maybe a better example would be the process that Thomas Edison went through in developing the light bulb and the set of tests and retests and changing one element at a time. This would be a good example of how to set up a situation for an extended response essay where we have a particular scenario. It's not completely extended response. We've limited it to this particular context, for example, Edison. But at the same time, we've also asked the students to formulate and generate the content of their essay. We haven't really led them to everything that they're going to do. Compared to interpretive exercises, both kinds of essays can assess much more complex learning outcomes. And it's the kind of thing that's missing on large-scale tests like the NWEA or the Terra Nova, which many districts have adopted as part of their assessment program. However, those assessment pieces really can't capture more complex learning outcomes. So some of the advantages, of course, are measuring these complex outcomes that we can't measure by other means. Restricted response essays require students to supply and not just identify the answer. Okay, so that's an important distinction. A savvy student that hasn't studied perhaps can deduce from a set of multiple choice distractors the correct answer, or at least can bring it down to a 50-50 shot for themselves. But that's not possible on a restricted response essay. They have to supply the answer. 2, they can target specific mental skills. Secondly, extended response essays emphasize integration and application of higher level skills. And so this is the kind of question that we might see in a social studies end of unit test or something, we'll say on the Civil War. And it talks about explain how X number of causes or X number of factors played into the start of the Civil War, and or conversely you might say explain how different socioeconomic issues or phenomenon in the United States brought about the end of the Civil War and brought about the resolution to that war in the direction that it ended up. In other words, pointing out all of the reasons that the North had won eventually. And then one could even extend that and say, what is one factor that might have changed the outcome? And or what are some factors that might have changed the outcome of that conflict? So those are the kinds of skills that you can measure, and they involve a great deal of synthesis and not just regurgitation, and they require original thought on the part of students. It's very difficult sometimes to accurately assess or evaluate across students their performances on a measure like this, though. Secondly, we can measure writing skills in addition to or instead of knowledge and understanding. So if you're doing a interdisciplinary course or you're trying to do cross-cutting standards, essay questions offer a lot of advantages to being able to just measure one thing at a time. Now we can get at this concept of writing simultaneously. Essays are easy to construct in a way, but only if you don't care what you actually measure and how reliably you do so. So it's easy to come up with an essay question, but you need to have some sort of a rubric, whether it's a holistic rubric or it's an analytical rubric, that ties directly to that question content. And finally, essays have the advantage of contributing to student learning directly and indirectly. And I think that this is an element of assessment and testing that is sometimes lost on the public, and I think lost on teachers. And that is that if it's done correctly, the act of studying for and then taking an exam solidifies knowledge in the minds of students, or it should. It forces students to prepare information in a certain way and then be able to relay that information back to the teacher. It's as much a learning thing as it is a demonstration event. And I think it's critical for us to remember that as teachers, that if a test can be an opportunity to learn, that's really its function. And then it also serves a secondary function of assessing the level of learning that the student has engaged in. So for example, the exam in this course, there were some folks that I had said, well, why don't you go ahead and rewrite this? Or I had, in cases where you hadn't done as well as you might have wanted to, especially on the constructed response items, encourage people to rewrite certain questions and resubmit them. So this gives students a second opportunity to engage in the material, to learn it more thoroughly, and then to demonstrate what they know. And it's fine with me. This is not, for example, a course that's graded on the curve. In other words, I have no aspirations to give a certain proportion of students anything less than an A in the course. Instead, I'd like to see everyone attain that grade, and am happy usually to give people quite a few opportunities to do so. It's something that isn't universally practiced with classroom teachers, I found, and I know that some of you that are administrators have run into this, where there are very definite grading policies, and they serve an important function in terms of ensuring that students take responsibility for their actions. On the other hand, there are cases, I think, where grading policies and the practices that teachers adopt can be so draconian that they really don't permit people to catch up once they get behind the eight ball. And I think that an open and honest conversation about that would be a very useful thing to have in your schools and maybe amongst your colleagues if you're teaching right now in a public classroom, a public education classroom. There are some limitations, of course, that are involved with essays. First of all, and I've alluded to this several times already, is the unreliability of scoring. And unless, of course, there are clear learning outcomes, good scoring rubrics, and then you've practiced in your scoring, even if you do these things, they will not be as reliable to score as will an objective test. You may say that they're much more important outcomes, and so therein lies the balancing point. How do we balance, on the one hand, what we think are the important things that students must learn with the fact that it's difficult for us to assess them reliably? One way that you could maybe feel better about that, at least personally, is this concept of letting students take another shot at things that they didn't get right. Now, that comes with a certain set of consequences. We won't get into that right now. The second one is that it's time-consuming to score, and it's especially if you're following guidelines. If you're following a rubric, it's difficult to go through a whole slew of essays and grade each one in a consistent and fair manner. This can be impossible if you're really conscientious in scoring. You want to give a lot of feedback. You have a lot of students. it's really not feasible in some cases. I know English teachers that have well over 100 students a day, and across multiple class sections. And if they were to have students write, say, every day and try to give them feedback, they would need to, every moment that they're not in school, be grading those papers, and that would be right through the night. That's just not feasible, and it's certainly not sustainable. I know English teachers that start out trying to do that, and that's all they do, nights and weekends. And very soon they either decide to move on from being an English teacher, or they have to change how they do things. And I think there are other ways that they can do it, but but it is pointing out one of the issues of trying to do an essay. The third is that we have a very limited sampling of our content domain. When we do an essay, we see that we're really asking for a lot of depth around a single question. And although we might integrate a lot of higher order thinking skills, the content domain measured is going to be relatively narrow. You're not going to get a lot of content. You're going to get a lot of synthesized information in your answers. So let's look at some suggestions for writing essay questions. First, make sure you restrict the use to learning outcomes that you can't measure well by other objective means. These should be things that require organization, synthesis, and originality. If this is something that's really content-driven, it's really unnecessary to use a constructed response item to measure something that is essentially measuring content knowledge. Make sure you write questions that call forth the intended mental processes. This is easiest to do with the restricted response items. Okay, we want a particular item or particular theory. We write a question that is targeted exactly to that, and that's it. I've got a handout that I'll post to the WebCT folder, and there are some sample stems in that handout, so that accompanies the slides, and it's labeled Gronlund Handout. C, for extended response items, it helps to state the evaluation criteria in the question. What is it that's important for your students to have done in the course of responding to your question? How many reasons do they need to state? How much evidence do they need to provide? Give them a sense of what it is that they're supposed to produce in order for them to be more accurate and more complete in their answer. You have to make sure that these questions don't exactly target things that have not been covered in teaching and readings. This should be the opportunity for students to synthesize information. If this is a completely new situation or context, that's fine. But it should still call forth the same kinds of summary learnings and integrated information and knowledge that has been covered so far in the course. So, for example, if on the first exam that I had asked you to talk about, writing essay questions, that wouldn't have been a fair question to ask. However, asking you about interpreting standard scores should have been a fair question because it was part of the readings and it was part of the lectures. So it wasn't something that you had done exactly before, but it required you to integrate your learning from the technical as well as the summative kinds of statements that I made in the video lecture, and draw those together and talk about interpreting the standard scores, for example, the John's Mom and the percentile rankings. And some folks really integrated that question very well, and other folks struggled a little bit more. And that is the point in having students write an essay question, is to give them a novel situation, but not with novel concepts. Try to phrase your question so that the student's task is clear and it's comparable for all, meaning all students. This is easiest, again, of course, with restricted response essays. You can be very specific, list 3 viable causes of the Civil War and why they led to the set of events that happened. Talking about Edison's earlier experiment, list 3 failures and what he learned from those failures, for example. That would be restricted response essays. That would be very tightly defined. There's only a finite list that's correct. But for extended response, you can't define the task so tightly that its purpose is spoiled. In other words, if you, in your essay about explaining the causes of the Civil War and what, if any, one of those things might have changed the outcome, if you're too specific about what the causes might have been or how the outcome might have changed, then you've spoiled your question. What you really want to get at is, did the students glean from your studies, from your information? Did they glean or did they understand what it was that the Civil War was really about, and what caused it, and how those things work together to bring about the outcome that happened, at least to the extent to which you've studied in your classroom. Instead, you're going to give specific instructions or explicit instructions on the kind of answer that's desired. Your answer should be confined to 100 to 150 words. Now, you notice that I do this on some of my tests, questions, and talk about it again here. I think that it's important to give students a sense of what it is that you expect for the answer. Some students will go so far beyond that what it does is it creates a problem for you. Maybe they've written this really excellent essay that provides much more detail than you really wanted, and even though you got a scoring rubric, it's very difficult then to give other students who wrote a perfectly good essay that was in fact exactly what you were looking for. You might want to mark them down relative to this excellent performance, this outstanding performance by a few students. By more realistically confining what it is that you expect for an answer, if you're in a criterion reference world, that's going to give you a more accurate ability to evaluate or assess or grade that particular item. If you let students just go, what happens is that you'll find this natural sorting process will happen on almost every essay. You'll have certain students that will go far beyond on each thing, and other students that sort of try to write to what you're expecting, and other students don't quite make it. And so you might say that that is exactly what you're trying to do, is to sort out those students who are really highly achieving from those who are not. And I guess I would challenge that and ask you, what is the purpose of having them write the essay? I think that it's worthwhile to have students write some essays that are maximal performance, but there are other cases where what we're really trying to measure is what is the criterion, what is the outcome that we want students to have gotten. And if it's about the outcome, then that maximal performance, that normative ranking that you're really engaging in when you let students, just show their very best, and some students' very best is much better than other students. If that's your purpose, that's fine. But if your purpose is a criterion, a specific learning objective or outcome, then that's a problem. Indicate an approximate time limit for each question. So give plenty of time. There should be a power test, not a speed test. It's interesting on the first exam that folks were given that they were concerned they didn't have enough time, and it's interesting because that's really the same exam. It's not the same questions, but the same length, same complexity as the exam that's given in class, all in one booklet. And people almost never take the entire time to finish the entire exam. But yet, when it moved to online, it became something very different. So I've got to reflect more on that piece. I don't want it to be a speed test. I want it to be a power test, for example, in this class. And that's a good example of how changing modalities or changing presentation methods, I think, has influenced the degree to which students can kind of engage with the test in the same way. Maybe the in-classroom testing situation gives them a different ability to take the test than does trying to do it online. Avoid optional questions. This is something that teachers often do. They'll say, choose any one of the following essays. By giving choices, it means students are taking different tests. And that might not be immediately obvious, but in fact that's exactly the case. If you have 20 students and you have 3 different essays, you have 3 different tests, at least for that portion of their grade, and it's very difficult to equate the difficulty of one item versus another versus another. The other thing is that it encourages students to not study the entire domain of knowledge that you're assessing. Now, it may be that you want students to pick this as an advanced assignment, and I guess then I would put it in a different category. That's more like a research paper. And you're measuring different kinds of learning outcomes in that case, and you're putting it within a structure that gives them choice and opportunity. But that's no longer a test essay. So I think it's important to be clear about what it is that you're measuring. If you're doing an in-class test, or even a take-home test perhaps, I think it's important for you to have a consistent set of questions for all the students and not have choices. I think the choices come in their own individual projects and homeworks as a component of their grade. There's no single correct or best answer to an essay question, so you have to have guidelines or rubrics for rating the quality of those answers. So a rubric is a set of guidelines for the application of performance criteria to responses and performances of students. You have to carefully specify what your scoring criteria are before you finalize your exam. You may have to rethink or modify your question based on what it is that you want for outcomes. That in turn enhances the likelihood of calling forth the intended responses, the things that you really wanted to get at. What is it that you want to see for a final product? What have you taught? What is it that students can realistically be expected to produce? And then do an initial review of your answers to a question to find exemplars and anchors for your scoring levels. So one of these methods is called the bookmarking method, and what we do is you might take all, say 20 responses that you get. You sort of read through them quickly. You determine which ones appear to be the best, which ones appear to be the worst, which ones are in the middle, and then you do a sorting piece. And you can do this in a normative sense, what are the best and what are the worst. You can also do this in terms of finding anchor papers, papers that are typical or are exemplars, if you will, of a particular performance level. And in this way we can say, is this paper better than this paper? Yes, it's a little better than this paper. Is it worse than the next paper? Yes, it's a little worse than the next paper. And so we know that it maybe goes between does not meets and meets as performance categories. Third, make sure that you can describe the kinds of performance in your scoring rubric. For example, student lists 2 of the 4 key points that qualify for each scoring level. For example, satisfactory might be 2 points. Each of the different performance levels should be attached to some kind of measurable or observable behavior or performance on the part of the student. So if they're writing an essay, they've included a certain amount of detail, or they've done a certain they've covered a certain set of material. Those things count in a specific manner for for credit, so that you're not just almost randomly marking students as having a good grade or a bad grade, but you're looking for key elements. So we find that using a rubric enhances reliability and validity and fairness in scoring. It also can save you quite a bit of time and headaches when you score the exam. And you need rubrics. There are 2 kinds. One is an analytical rubric, which is really focused on discrete elements in the essay. They include this, they include that, they include the 3 causes, they include 4 events, and it lists these out in a quantitative fashion. The other type is a holistic rubric. So we'll take a look at a couple of each of these kinds of rubrics. So, one way is that we can write or identify exemplar answers and decide how to give points for each part of the expected or the full answer. We have to decide the level of explanation that we need for full versus partial credit. And so for analytic rubrics for extended response questions, we have to specify what the separate characteristics or dimensions that we want to score are. Is it mechanics? Is it to what degree did they provide extending points or elaboration? To what degree did they focus on a single issue for perhaps an expository essay? And then we have to assign levels to each one of these performance, 1 to 7, 1 to 4, poor to excellent, whatever. Then we add those things up and we put them in a performance category based on where they score. We have to summarize the performance corresponding to each level. The main idea is present, but it may not maintain consistent focus, or for adequate achievement. And we might give them 3 points, or X points I put here, for focus. The result is we wind up with a matrix against which we can judge the elements of each essay. So this is not unlike the blueprint in some ways that you're writing for your assessment assignment for the final project for the course. It's also not unlike the rubric that I provided you to score that thing. If you look at that, that's really kind of an analytic rubric. Mostly it's an analytic rubric. So that is the kind of matrix that I'm talking about. So if you want an example of that, that's a good one to take a look at. Analytic rubrics are also good for giving feedback to your students. They can see, where did I go wrong with my essay? Oh, it was my mechanics, or oh, I didn't stick to the point, or oh, I didn't give enough supporting ideas. And I've given you a link here to take a look at some websites for some examples. And this is the Northwest Regional Education Lab. And there's a toolkit in here, and it's about measuring different kinds of academic outcomes and using rubrics to do that. Holistic rubrics for extended response questions provide a single overall score. There's no separate dimensions. You have to decide how many levels that this is going to have, and you're going to have to just summarize the performance corresponding to each level. And what this does is it really summarizes across multiple dimensions a holistic response. You know, if grammar is good, the extended details are well supported. We have a variety of different kinds of information that are presented. So we have this sort of collection of different qualities that all come together, and then we put rating categories based on how well each one of those things is done. It's easier to construct and apply than analytic rubrics, and it may correspond better to grading needs, I think. It provides less feedback to students about their strengths and weaknesses. So for example, on your essay for the first exam, you'll notice that there was a holistic rubric that was provided with that, and it's on a 10-point scale. So you might want to take a look at that rubric. That's one example. The Northwest Regional Lab also has other examples of some rubrics that you can take a look at. So be looking for the final set of slides and lecture notes for the course this week, and that will be on looking at students with diverse needs, providing accommodations, and we'll be tying up the course this week. So good luck to everyone, and make sure that you let me know if you have questions, and I will get back to you quickly by email. And good luck.